Human trafficking, two words which were once viewed as a foreign issue, have hit closer to home than Canadians may have realized in previous years. Not only have occurrences of this modern-day slavery risen on Canadian soil, but the province of Ontario alone has been coined as the hub, and the Halton Region being identified as one of its many revolving doors. Human trafficking is not only a highly underreported issue across the country, but the rise in cases reported across the province and region has said to be a cause for great concern. With a continuing vast array of questions surrounding this detrimental issue, both provincial and municipal efforts to combat human trafficking remain a rather large puzzle, with its pieces slowly creating a much bigger picture. It is dark and cold, hidden and heinous. It is a painful and loud space where people are a commodity, a place where survival depends on one's own price tag. It is hidden within our communities, yet happening all around us.
I had been groomed and trained to satisfy whatever clients, whatever people that were being brought to me.
Over the past several years, there has been a rise in police-reported cases across the country, province, and region, hinting to Canadians that human trafficking has been at our doorsteps all along.
I never got any money. I was just a kid. I mean, I still went to school. I still, everything, nothing changed except for my sense of self. Everything inside changed, crumbled.
Challenging for victims to escape, along with foggy rhetoric used to identify human trafficking, has left the numbers blurry and difficult to detect. The first time comparable data was collected was in a 2009-2016 report conducted by Statistics Canada. The report indicates that during this time period, there was just over 1,000 police-reported incidents across the country, with this figure on a steady rise since 2010.
Numbers are hard because we already know that it's underreported. So a lot of the initial numbers that we're feeding data that the government and Stats Canada are using is coming from police reported. But if we take a look at the trend for domestic violence, if we take a look at the trends for sexual violence, we recognize that those are also underreported. So there's a lot of things that are happening in the community that we aren't aware of and we're not tracking. And the momentum that's been building, especially with Jennifer Richardson coming into Ontario and running the Provincial Anti-Human Trafficking Office, is that Ontario now has a strategy. We actually have a federal strategy as well, right? So what is that doing? It's engaging the community to start training, to start being able to recognize, and what we're having is the police officers are better equipped to detect, to investigate, and to help and facilitate that reporting process with survivors. So is it decreasing or increasing? It's very difficult to measure. What I can say is it's been happening for a very long time. When we look back at the domestic violence shelters, when we look at the sexual assault centers, they've been seeing it. It's just that, did they have the language to call trafficking what it was, right? And if we think about legality, we just recently, in recent years, changed from using the language of prostitution to recognizing this is child sex trafficking, this is human trafficking, this is labor trafficking, this is forced marriage, this is domestic servitude. So we're understanding the language to be using, and now we're applying it into the individuals that we're supporting.
And with such data specific to police-reported incidents, can only make one question: just how many people are actually being trafficked that have not been accounted for? From the same Statistics Canada report, which was conducted over an 8-year period, Ontario alone had 2/3 of these police-reported only offences, making human trafficking in Ontario more than 1.5 times the national rate, and a provincial hotbed for trafficking activity.
When we look at the average age of a girl being recruited, it's just 13 years old. It's a teenager, that's a young person. And it's so important to educate those young people, as well as educating parents, grandparents, people in different industries. I know we've been working closely with the tourism industry, those working in hotels, because they're the ones in the front line who are seeing the possibility of human trafficking. The Trucking Association is also training their truck drivers in signs to look for in human trafficking, because as we know, the 400 series highway is a hot spot for moving victims across the province.
Those most at risk are youth in care, our Indigenous population, and anyone who is being impacted by poverty, along with job security. We also know that across Canada, 95% of these cases have involved women, and that 72% of the victims were under the age of 25. This is also where the main objective for intervention services such as Savis of Halton comes to the forefront. By working towards supporting victims turned survivors, Savis's collaborative against human trafficking exists to create and support a unified community, while also acting as a regional response to this major public issue.
Globally, the average age of recruitment is around 13 and a half years old, so very young. Our youth are being exploited. What we're noticing here in Halton, which is a little bit different, is our vice unit is noticing that the individuals that they're helping are from the ages of 18 to 20. So we do recognize that there are underage child sex trafficking happening and minor trafficking happening, but it's also within the age range of 18 to 20 that we're noticing in our region at Halton.
When we talk about human trafficking, I think it's fair to say that a large majority of the trafficking is sexual in nature. Not to say that labor trafficking isn't an issue in our region as well. Both, I would say, is something that we investigate. When we talk about the victims of human trafficking, some are definitely from our region. I don't believe one could say that a victim meets a certain mold. They could absolutely come from this region in the sense of just coming from middle-class families. However, there are circumstances where, because where we're situated along the GTA and the Golden Horseshoe, victims are from other areas, including the province of Quebec.
In terms of who in the community we're helping, yes, the majority of numbers are coming from youth, young women, and grown women adults, but we're also noticing that we do have trans individuals who are being exploited. We have worked with young men who have been exploited, and the dilemma with accessing services is that are there enough sufficient services that are geared to one specific gender? Here at Savis, we understand that role of having an inclusive space. So even the crisis and transitional units that we offer through our program, it's not a shelter style, it's one unique space for that individual. So in terms of accessibility, it's accessible to an individual whether they self-identify as female, whether they're identifying as male, intersex, trans, non-binary, they can access that space. Because we recognize that the gender stereotypes in society can prevent someone from actually seeking help.
Support not only for recent survivors, but also continuing support for long-term survivors. According to a 2018 consultations report conducted by the federal government of Canada, survivor roundtable discussions led to a further understanding of this particular need, amongst other top priorities.
Well, that was definitely heard loud and clear from the organizations that we worked with, was having that annualized funding that was predictable each year, because the current funding was set to end March of 2020. So of course, people are starting to be concerned about that. So it was very exciting for me to announce today that it was going to be $20 million per year, and that would continue, because we need to be supporting our victims. And I've met with our police services, and they recognize that they can do what they can to help a girl exit from trafficking, but it's really the supports that are there afterwards, the wraparound supports that our great organizations serving women all across the province are doing, and now will continue to do with that predictability year after year.
One of these long-term survivors is Robin Z, who was victimized for over 25 years in the sex trade before escaping at the age of 34.
Can you tell me about the day that you were taken into the sex trade?
Well, mine started out with one, having been sexually abused at such a young age. I think that it cracked my foundation. I don't remember which day it was, but I remember being in the basement, and I felt, if I could do an analogy, it was like a massive piece of Velcro. And you know the sound it makes when you tear it apart? That was me. I was disconnecting, disassociating, and separating from myself. And it's not an intellectual thing that you go, okay, I need to do this in order to survive. It's an automatic thing, which, you know, you do what you need to do to survive. So I would say 8 or 9, maybe 10, when sex trafficking began. But we didn't have words like, I mean, that didn't exist back then.
Conversing with Robin also brought forth the confusion surrounding what it actually means to be a trafficked individual. Where Hollywood movies and pop culture have shown trafficked individuals to be predominantly kidnapped, Robin clarifies that a potential victim is more likely to be targeted and groomed.
You have a relationship, it's good until you're being groomed. And like any good pedophile or any good con artist or any good trafficker or pimp, because the term is exchangeable, they prey on, they have good assessment skills. They prey on your weaknesses, on vulnerabilities, they know what to say, and you're basically put into a situation where, particularly for young people, it's an adult situation and you don't know how to get out. You know, like, you know, he's my boyfriend. He buys me things. Even with my daughter, I mean, I said, you know, if a boy gives you a cell phone, that's a red flag. You know, you think, oh, because he loves me and because he wants to be in touch with me all the time. No, he wants, you know, the circle starts to contract and become very small, and they start to isolate you. And that's pretty much how it goes.
With such strategic planning, traffickers are continuously on the lookout. Although it is rare for the grooming process to be longer than a few months at most, traffickers don't always groom their victims in the same manner.
In the simplest way, we always frame it in 3 questions. So what's being done? And generally what's happening is there's some sort of recruitment, there's transportation, there's harboring of an individual. And the next question that we ask is, how are they doing this? How are they recruiting? How are they harboring? How are they transporting? And generally what's happening is there's coercion, there's manipulation, there's threats, and what's the purpose? Why is it being done? And it's for the exploitation of a person, whether that's forced labor, servitude, for sexual exploitation. Basically, the easiest way to explain it is what's happening, how is it happening, and why is it being done?
And for a long time I thought that I chose this pimp. And I would go from one pimp to another because back then we didn't have internet. And there's a courtship that happens. It's like poaching, right? So people courting, and you're trying to, pimps and traffickers are trying to grow their stable. It's just like horses, you know. They have more than one. You're not the only girl. And this applies to young boys as well. But for me, I would go from one to the other because in the interim, it would give me a break. That was my, you know, you get a day or two of being taken out to a restaurant and trying to be swayed to jump ship. So you're jumping from one ship to another. They're all disastrous.
So we understand the psychological trauma that can happen and be experienced by a survivor of trafficking. What we recognize is that there are individuals who are recruiting young girls and women to engage in the sex trade, and they're doing that by building connection, relationships, and sometimes it's the appearance of a boyfriend, and we recognize that. So having conversations with individuals before they may be able to recognize trafficking can actually be harmful. So what we do is we best support them while they're in the situation that they're at. Are they engaging in sexual services? What does that look like? How can we educate them on safety practices? How do we instill a check-in process? How can we still be present for that individual? We hear time again that survivors who have exited successfully, and by successfully I mean that there's been a gap in time from them re-entering. So what we know is that it takes several attempts to transition out of that lifestyle and reintegrate. And what we're hearing from those individuals who've been able to integrate is that it's taking them time to recognize that what was happening to them, where they thought that they were an independent sex worker or they were making the choice to, they're starting to realize and unpack the psychological trauma and recognize that, hey, this didn't feel consensual, I didn't have choices, and this is trafficking.
And in the digital age, traffickers have a new and fast breeding ground. With easier than ever access across social media platforms, traffickers can now target, approach, and groom their victims, and it can all be done hidden behind their digital screens.
There's a high demand for young people, and 13, 14, and they look a lot older than certainly we did when we were 13 and 14. There's the internet. There's Snapchat and all these, my daughter has met lots of people on Instagram and everything else. And it's given me quite a few gray hairs because it's good until it's not good. And usually you can be groomed for maybe a month, 2 months, 3 months. It doesn't usually go on for you're not going to be groomed for a year, usually, because, it's all about the $90. Mm-hmm. And you can have a trafficker say, oh, baby, it's just this one time, I'm in a jam, or the threat of making it public, they're going to high school. Can you imagine having to go back to your school where everybody knows you work the sex trade?
So it's a different game with social media.
It's a totally different game with social media.
Robin sits not only on the Hamilton Coalition, but also the Halton Coalition for Anti-Human Trafficking. It is here where Robin utilizes her first-hand experience within the sex trade to not only bring awareness, but to voice the barriers and supports needed for human trafficking survivors.
Yes, I do sit on the two coalitions, one in Hamilton and one in the Halton Region. Hamilton because I live here, and Halton because it's I think it's a hard nut to crack because it's an area where the general population, it doesn't happen here, right? And it does. It actually happens a lot more there because there's so many highways and hotels, right? So there's quick escape. And it doesn't, if you're living in a big house and there's a bunch of girls coming in and out, people don't think much of it, It just doesn't. I went for a facial, and the woman actually said that her neighbors, all of a sudden the police were there and girls were being trafficked out of the house, probably for about a year, and nobody knew. I think that I remember when I first started sitting on as a consultant for both Halton and Hamilton, I tear up a lot. That's where I tear up. Because there wasn't any supports in my day. The fact that there's some. And there are some great women working, the YWCA, EFRI, Savis, Good Shepherd.
Reviewing the current consequences for arrested traffickers can seem grim. Statistics Canada also highlights studies exposing the barriers in the legal system when it comes to prosecution, leaving in previous years the majority of human trafficking court cases resulting in decisions of stayed or withdrawn. Statistics from the same report indicate that about 64% of cases with a guilty finding, the perpetrator was sentenced to custody, and for 32%, sentenced to probation.
I think that their main concern is getting the victim into safety, and then charges is the second issue. Also, sentencing needs to be increased. I personally would love to see the assets of offenders seized. Now, they're not stupid. So if I was making, so each victim brings in roughly $250,000 to $350,000 a year tax-free. That's per person. You got 5 or 6. That's a lot of money not being taxed. And it must be going somewhere. So, you know, they bought their mother a house, and chances are they're not going to buy a distant cousin. So all those assets should be frozen until the parent, or whoever's name is on the deed, can prove that those funds came legally. If not, we take the house. And then we have a shelter.
Just such a different life. It's very much as if I've gone on the other side of the coin. I have a pretty good imagination. I had no idea there'd be days like this.
Free of the sex trade for nearly 3 decades, Robin is now an award-winning performer, speaker, and author of her one-woman show and book, Borderline Me, which Z shares her life experience before, during, and after the sex trade. Also an activist for anti-human trafficking, Robin joined Savvis this past fall for a community update in Oakville. Announced was a grant presented to Savvis and its partners Elizabeth Fry and Summit Housing for their Continuum of Care program.
It's not just sex trafficking, there's labor trafficking, there is domestic servitude, and it affects folks with cognitive disabilities, it affects folks with physical disabilities sometimes. So this grant helped us really truly understand the need that we have in the community, not just in South Halton, but all over, even in Halton Hills.
It's a huge partnership. We heavily rely on the community, including hotel staff. We just recently had an educational piece through Crime Stoppers where the hotel staff attended for the purposes of being a little bit more aware about what's happening along the lines of the hotels, and knowing what options they have in terms of reporting incidents that they believe are human trafficking.
On the same day, the Ontario government echoed the Halton Region by announcing not only their new strategy to combat human trafficking, but also new annual funding that the province plans to put into strengthening victim supports and enforcement.
Today's announcement was fantastic news, and I'm very passionate about anti-human trafficking and how we can be doing more. So today the Premier announced that myself and the Solicitor General would be co-leads on the new anti-human trafficking strategy. Part of that strategy is investing $20 million annually into supports for victims as well as cracking down on those offenders. And this is great news because this summer I hosted 13 roundtables all across the province. I also visited with over 15 shelters. I visited our Violence Against Women coordinating committees. So I heard firsthand from those who are on the front lines, for those with lived experience and those in the community safety sector who are seeing the results and what happens with human trafficking. And so today's announcement is very important because what we heard very strongly was that they needed annualized funding for it to be predictable and how they could move forward and support these victims.
With the now provincial and regional backing, the fight against human trafficking is picking up speed. However, the question still remains, are they working fast enough? Only time will tell if the new Ontario strategy and its local initiatives will be what government officials, organizations, and residents have been hoping for. And when it comes to survivors, it will be the long-term support and care they have long needed and have been asking for.
My daughter didn't know I've never shared any details with her. But as she got older, she knew. I mean, she wrote me a letter for my 60th birthday that said, "Mama, your life experiences are things that horror movies are based on. And I want you to know that you didn't deserve any of it. Oh my God, I'm gonna get emotional. You know, she was 17 when she wrote that.